Okay, let's keep looking at these divisions of the brain. So we just looked at the cerebrum. Now let's look at the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is going to be the place directly below the cerebrum, below the corpus callosum, and below the ventricles. So we're going to be looking at two structures in here, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now the thalamus is, like I mentioned before, is kind of a relay station. So if you think about all those places that we talked about in the cerebral cortex, in those lobes that process speech and motor and sensory and all that stuff, the thalamus is going to be the place that directs those signals. So the message comes up from the spinal cord, it reaches the thalamus, and then the thalamus will direct it to the cerebral cortex from there. So it's a relay point. Now, right below the thalamus is going to be the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to be a big regulator of homeostasis. All right, so maintaining an internal environment within the body. It's going to have some control over the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and it's also going to influence heartbeat, blood flow, and very, very importantly, it's going to have a lot of control over the endocrine system, which is the system that controls hormonal balance within our body. So the hypothalamus has a big role to play in controlling the endocrine system, which controls the body's hormones. Now, below the diencephalon, we're going to have the brainstem, and the brainstem is going to consist of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The brainstem is how we connect the cerebrum at the diencephalon to the spinal cord. Okay, we've got those three divisions. We've got the midbrain, which is going to be the very top part of the brainstem, right below the diencephalon. There's going to be four different masses that make up the midbrain. Don't worry about those names, but this part of the brain, the midbrain, is going to be where we get impulses being conducted between the higher centers of the cerebrum and the lower centers of the brain, like the pons and the medulla and the cerebellum, that move into the spinal cord. So it's another place where we have a relaying of signals. This part of the brain is also going to be involved with the reflexes that we have that involve our eyes and our ears. So how we react reflexively to visual cues and also auditory cues. Now, below the midbrain, we're going to have the pons, and the pons again is going to have some reflexive control, so especially involving our breathing, and it's going to be a link between the cerebellum and the rest of the nervous system. So the cerebellum will tie in directly to the pons, and that allows it connection to the rest of the nervous system. And then finally, right before we get to the spinal cord, the very top of the spinal cord, it starts to swell, and that swelling is the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata controls some very base functions that we need to have in order to survive. So our cardiac center is there, our respiratory center is there, so it controls our breathing rate, our heart rate. It also has roles to play in the vasomotor center, so how our blood vessels are controlled, and the contralateral control, so how we control opposite sides of our body so that we stay in rhythm, in sync with other parts of our body. And the final division that we have of the brain is the cerebellum. Now there's three parts to the cerebellum, and we didn't look too much at this in the lab, but the cerebellum doesn't exactly have that same longitudinal fissure that we would see in the cerebrum. The three parts are going to be the vermis, which we'd find in the median anterior part. Then we'll have a left and a right hemisphere. And the functions of the cerebellum are they help coordinate voluntary muscles, so it allows us to have smooth, coordinated muscle movement. It also helps us maintain balance, so when you're standing up, it's the fine tuning of the movements through the cerebellum that allows you to have good, smooth balance instead of jerky movements. And it also helps us maintain muscle tone, so it keeps muscles contracted when we need to in order to maintain balance and equilibrium. So here's a look at the brainstem and the cerebellum. You can see the three parts, the left, the right hemispheres, and the vermis, the kind of bump in the middle there. And then you can also see down in this picture here how the cerebellum fits slightly inferior to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum, and it has the attachment point right here at the pons. Okay, so far we've been talking about divisions of the brain. So, structures that we can easily identify within the brain. But we also have these networks of neurons that we call a neuronal network. And these can be pretty widespread throughout the central nervous system. And there's a few examples of these. They're kind of a little bit more difficult to describe exactly, but they do exist and they do have some functions. So we'll do our best to explain them here now. First of all, we have the limbic system. Now, the limbic system is a group of neurons, like the name suggests, and it's going to be between the cerebrum and the diencephalon. And I'm going to show you a picture of where it is in a couple of seconds. It's involved in emotional states. It can have a lot to do with our behavior. It's also involved in our learning, in our long-term memory. It can also help link the functions of the cerebral cortex and the brainstem together, and it will stimulate reticular formation, which is our state of consciousness. So what we're thinking about when we're awake. So that's the limbic system. The next thing we have are these groups of ganglia, which are sometimes a name that we give to groups of nervous tissue. So the basal ganglia, they're small groups of nervous tissue that will help regulate the initiation, so the beginning, and the termination or the end of certain movements. And finally, we have the reticular formation. Now, the reticular formation has a major role to play in waking up from sleep. It has control over the reticular activating system, which is how we wake up and how we are or how we act while we're conscious, and it also has a role to play with muscle tone. So in the next slide here, let's have a quick look at these different neuronal networks. Whoops, one slide too far. So if we look here, you'll see the limbic system, and it's highlighted in orange. So we can see there's different parts that make up the limbic system. I'm not interested in you guys knowing this, but it's made up of the cingulate gyrus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. So these structures together make up our limbic system. If we want to talk about our reticular formation, this is going to be another structure that we find. It goes deep, and it's inside the pons and the medulla oblongata. It kind of goes in this area right here, and this is the area that's responsible for our behavior when we're conscious, our ability to wake up from sleep, and so on. And then we also have these basal ganglia, and we can find groups of these in this area right here, and there's a couple of more places around the brain where you'd find them, and these are going to be these groups of neurons that will help start motion or movement, and it'll help end our movement as well. So those are three different groups of neurons that we can find within the brain that have common functions, but they're not exactly a certain part of the brain. They're kind of scattered in between different subdivisions of the brain. Okay. The last thing we're going to talk about when we're talking about the brain are the cranial nerves. Now, the cranial nerves are the nerves that originate directly from the brain, okay? There's 12 pairs, so that means there's 24 nerves that come directly off the brain. There's 4 categories of these cranial nerves. Don't worry about them. I don't expect you to realize these categories or remember them, but just know that there's a special sensory impulses, there's general sensory impulses, somatic motor impulses, and visceral motor impulses. So these nerves fall within those 4 categories, but I don't expect you to remember those. Okay, so here's a look at the 12 different cranial nerves. So they're always numbered by Roman numerals, so 1 through 12. And we always start at the anterior part of the brain and work our way posterior. So the first one there is the olfactory, then we have the optic, the oculomotor, the trochlear, the trigeminal, abducens, the facial, the vestibulocochlear, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, the accessory, and the hypoglossal. So those are 12 of the cranial nerves, and like I said, they originate on the brain. Now, a good way to remember these long lists of stuff like that is to come up with a mnemonic device. Now, these are very customizable. They're very personal things. This is just a sentence off the top of my head, or the top of somebody's head, to help you remember the order and the different cranial nerves. So, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. So if you remember that sentence and you remember the first letter of each word, you'll be able to remember all of the cranial nerves. So olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular, trochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. So every one of those, the first letter of every word represents a cranial nerve. I'm more concerned about you guys knowing what the nerves are and what their functions are. So the next couple of slides go through that. Okay. So remember, the purpose of these nerves is to collect information from the senses and bring that information to the brain. So when we're talking about the olfactory nerve, we're talking about impulses from the sense of smell. For the optic nerve, we're talking about impulses from the eyes. Ocular motor, that controls the contractions of the eye muscles. So the muscles inside the eye that help focus the lens is controlled by the oculomotor nerve. The trochlear nerve will supply one eyeball muscle with a nerve impulse, so it moves one part of the muscle within the eye. The trigeminal carries sensory impulses from the eye, the upper jaw, and the lower jaw. And the abducens muscle nerve, controls eye muscle with nerve impulse. So if you're wondering how important our vision and our eyes are to us, just look at how many cranial nerves are involved in the control of the eyes. The seventh cranial nerve is going to be the facial nerve. That's going to control the muscles of the facial expression, and it's also going to have sensation of taste. The vestibulocochlear nerve is going to carry impulses for hearing as well as equilibrium, so our sense of balance. The glossopharyngeal nerve is going to carry sensory impulses from the tongue and the pharynx. That'll help us control swallowing while we're eating. The vagus nerve is going to supply most of the impulses in the thoracic and the abdominal cavity. So the vagus nerve extends all the way down into the thoracic and the abdominal cavity and collects information about those areas. The accessory nerve is going to control muscles in the neck and the larynx, so that'll allow us to turn our heads as well as speak. And then finally, the last one there is the hypoglossal, and that's going to control the muscles of our tongue.